I want to be upfront with you about something before this story goes anywhere. What I did was not smart. It was not something I would recommend. And if anyone who knows me professionally ever reads this, I would like to remind them that context matters and that I turn out fine. I follow my crush. Not in the romantic sense. Not first. I literally followed her. On foot. Through downtown Portland, Oregon on a Wednesday afternoon in October because I had run out of excuses to walk in the same direction and decided that curiosity was close enough to a reason. My name is Cole Merritt. I am 34 years old. I am a freelance urban photographer, which means I take pictures of cities and the people in them and somehow convince publications and architecture firms and the occasional very patient gallery to pay me for it. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District that costs more than it should and has a north-facing window that I chose the place entirely for. I'm not a person who does impulsive things. I make lists. I back up my files in 3 places. I have a system for everything, including my coffee order, which has not changed in 6 years. And then I saw her at the farmer's market on a Saturday in September, and my system for everything quietly stopped being relevant. Here's what I noticed in order. First, the coat. It was a burnt orange wool coat in a market full of gray and navy, and it was doing exactly what a coat like that is supposed to do, which is make every other coat in the vicinity feel like it is not trying hard enough. Second, the way she was looking at a table of ceramic mugs. Not casually browsing, actually looking. Picking one up, turning it over, reading the bottom, setting it down, picking up another. The kind of attention people give to things they genuinely care about understanding. Third, when she looked up and caught me looking, she did not look away first. I did. I'm telling you that detail because it is important to the story and also because it is embarrassing, and I believe in being honest about embarrassing things. I did not talk to her that day. I told myself I would circle back. I circled back. She was gone. I spent the rest of the market walk pretending to be interested in artisan hot sauce and thinking about a burnt orange coat and the way a person looks at a ceramic mug when nobody is watching. For 2 weeks, I went back to normal. Work, coffee, north-facing window, system for everything. Then I saw her again on a Tuesday evening at a reading at Powell's Books. She was 3 rows ahead of me, and she laughed once at something the author said, and I recognized the laugh. The kind that happens before a person decides if it is appropriate. Quick and real, and a little surprised at itself. After the reading, people milled around, and I positioned myself in the general vicinity of the book signing table in a way that I would like to describe as casual and cannot. She was talking to a woman beside her about the author's use of architecture as metaphor in the novel. She said the building was doing half the emotional work of the story, and the author just had to show up and not ruin it. The woman beside her agreed. I agreed in my head loudly. I still did not introduce myself. I went home and lay on my couch and had a direct conversation with myself about the fact that I was a 34-year-old adult who had managed to not speak to the same woman twice and was now thinking about her at 11 on a Tuesday night on my own couch. The conversation concluded that I was behaving in a way inconsistent with my self-image and that I should do something about it. I did not do something about it. What I did instead was see her a 3rd time. It was the Wednesday afternoon I mentioned. October. I was coming out of a coffee shop on Burnside with my camera bag over one shoulder when I saw the burnt orange coat, half a block ahead, moving at a purposeful pace through the afternoon crowd. My brain did something that I can only describe as a short circuit followed by a decision that bypassed my better judgment entirely. I walked in the same direction. I want to be clear that I was not sneaking. I was not hiding behind things. I was walking on a public sidewalk in the same direction as another person, which is something thousands of people do every day in this city. The fact that I had a specific reason for choosing that direction is a technicality. She walked 4 blocks south, turned east on Couch Street, stopped at a crosswalk, turned right, and went into a building that had a small brass sign next to the door. I stopped on the sidewalk across the street and read the sign. It said Linden Studio, Architecture and Urban Design. I stood there processing this information. The farmer's market mugs. The Powells reading about buildings carrying emotional weight. Now an architecture firm. I took a picture of the building's facade because it was genuinely good architecture and because I needed something to do with my hands and because my camera is how I process things I do not yet understand. I went home and thought about what I was going to do about this. What I did was email the firm. Not because of her. Partially not because of her. I had been meaning to reach out to architecture firms about potential collaboration work for 2 years. Photography and architecture have an obvious relationship, and I had a portfolio that justified the conversation, and the email I sent was entirely professional and made no reference to burnt orange coats or farmers markets. I sent it Thursday morning. Friday afternoon, I got a reply from someone named Linden Studio Scheduling saying they would be happy to arrange a portfolio review meeting the following Wednesday at 2. I showed up at 1:50 because that is who I am. The studio was exactly what you would hope an architecture firm in Portland would be. Open floor plan, exposed concrete, drafting tables that were actually being used, a wall of project photographs going back what looked like 15 years. The receptionist was a guy named Pete who had the easy manner of someone who had been there long enough to not be impressed by anything. He offered me water and told me someone would be right with him, and I stood near the project wall and looked at the photographs and felt, for the first time in the 2 weeks since the farmer's market, that I was in a place that made sense to me. Then a door opened down the hall. The burnt orange coat was on a hook just inside the door. She was not wearing it. She was in a dark blue shirt with her sleeves pushed up and her hair pulled half back, and she was looking at a tablet in her hand and talking to someone behind her about load-bearing specifications. She finished the sentence, looked up, and saw me. There was a pause that lasted about 1 second and contained a significant amount of information. She recovered first. She walked toward me with her hand out and said, "I am Ren Calloway. I am one of the partners here. You must be the photographer." I shook her hand and said Cole Merritt. She said, "I looked at your portfolio online before today. The infrastructure series from Chicago is strong." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Specifically the way you treat negative space. Most photographers fill it. You use it." I said, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said about that series." She looked at me with the careful assessing look of someone deciding if a compliment was genuine or strategic. I held the look. She said, "Follow me." I followed her. We spent 45 minutes going through my portfolio at a large drafting table while she asked questions that were specific and technical and not remotely small talk. She wanted to know my process for shooting existing structures versus active construction sites. She wanted to know how I handled low light in interior spaces without losing texture. She asked about a photograph from a series I had done on Portland bridges the previous spring and said the angle on the Hawthorne implied a relationship between the structure and the water below that felt intentional. I said it was. She said good. She hated when things that looked intentional turned out to be accidents. I said I did too. At the end, she closed the portfolio and said we have 3 projects in the next 6 months that could use documentation at different phases. She said she would talk to her partner and get back to me by end of week. She stood and I stood, and she walked me to the door, and she paused at the door and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Have we met before?" I said, "I do not think so." She looked at me with those assessing eyes. She said, "You look familiar." I said, "Portland is a small city." She said, "That is a very Portland answer." I said, "I know." I walked out to the street. I got half a block away and stopped and tipped my head back and looked at the October sky above the buildings and said out loud to nobody in particular that this was going to be complicated. A woman walking a dog looked at me briefly and kept walking. She was right to keep walking. End of week came, and Pete from the studio called and said Ren and her partner Gus had agreed to bring me on for all 3 projects. He said the first one started in 2 weeks and that Ren would be the primary contact. I said that was great. I said it in the calm and measured voice of a person who had not been thinking about this exact outcome every day since Wednesday. I hung up and sat at my desk for a full 5 minutes. Then I opened a new folder on my hard drive and labeled it Linden Studio Work and told myself that the only thing I was going to feel about Ren Calloway going forward was professional. I believed that for about 4 days. The first project was a mixed-use building going up in the Central East Side. 4 stories, ground floor commercial, residential above, designed with the neighborhood's industrial history factored into every visible surface. It was the kind of project that made me understand why people became architects. The building was in conversation with its surroundings instead of ignoring them, which is rarer than it should be. Ren walked me through the site on a gray November morning with a hard hat that she wore like it was a natural part of her outfit, and a set of drawings. She referenced the way I referenced light, constantly, and without having to look for them. She explained the design decisions with the same specificity she had brought to the portfolio review. Not performing expertise, just using it. I asked questions, and she answered them. And when I asked something she found interesting, she paused a half-second before answering, and I started to look for that pause because it meant I had found an edge of something worth understanding. I shot for 4 hours that first day. She left after 2 to get back to the studio, but told me to text if I needed access to any closed sections. I texted twice. She replied both times in under 3 minutes with information and no filler. No problem, or of course, just the information I needed in a clear sentence. I found that extremely efficient and completely characteristic of everything I had observed about her. Over the next 3 weeks, I was on site 6 times. She joined me for parts of 4 of them. We developed a rhythm that I recognized from the best professional collaborations I had been part of. She knew what she needed documented and trusted me to find the angle that served it. I knew what I was seeing architecturally, and she trusted that reading. There was very little wasted conversation, which sounds like a cold thing, but in practice felt like respect. What there also was underneath all the efficiency was something harder to categorize. She made coffee on the mornings I came to the studio to transfer files, and she made it without asking if I wanted some, which meant she had noted my preference and acted on it without announcement. I fixed a loose bracket on her standing desk one morning when I noticed it wobbling, because I had a tool in my bag, and it was a 2-minute job, and she said thank you, and then 2 days later left a book on the edge of my work table at the studio without a note. It was a collection of essays about documentary photography and cities. I read it in 2 sittings, and the margin notes she had left in pencil in the first 3 essays were better than the essays. I did not mention the margin notes to her directly. I mentioned one of the ideas from them in a conversation about the East Side project, and she looked at me with a very specific expression that meant she knew I had read them and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. She decided not to. I respected that completely. Her business partner, Gus, was a broad, comfortable man in his late 40s who had the easy confidence of someone who had been doing what he loved for long enough to stop being nervous about it. He had been partners with Ren for 7 years and treated her with the particular quality of respect that exists between people who have built something real together. He liked me immediately and without reservation, which I appreciated, and he had the habit of saying true things casually as if they were observations about the weather. The 3rd week of the project, he stopped next to me while I was reviewing shots on my camera and looked at the screen and said, "You shoot buildings the way they want to be shot." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Some photographers shoot architecture, and you can see the photographer. With you can see the building. Is a different thing." I said, "I try to disappear into it." He said, "Ren works the same way." I looked at him. He was looking at my camera screen with a neutral expression. I said, "She is very good at what she does." He said, "She's the best I have ever worked with." He paused. "She is also very private, which I am mentioning for no particular reason." Then he walked away, and I stood with my camera and thought about a man who said things casually as if they were observations about the weather. The second project started in December. A residential renovation in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. A house from the 1920s that the owners wanted updated without losing what made it worth keeping. Ren said in the briefing that the goal was to make it feel like it had always been this way, like the new parts were remembering something the old parts knew. I wrote that down. She noticed and said, "You write things down." I said, "When they are worth keeping." She looked at her own notes. Something in her expression went briefly somewhere else and then came back. I started to understand that there were things Ren Calloway did not talk about. Not in an evasive way. In the way a person does not talk about something when they have decided that talking about it is not the most useful approach to managing it. She was precise about work and generous in a contained way and genuinely funny when something struck her, which happened more than people who only knew her professionally would have expected. But there was a layer underneath all of that which she kept entirely to herself, and I respected it because it was hers to keep. What I could not fully manage was the fact that I was becoming more interested in her with every passing week in a way that had moved well past the burnt orange coat and the farmer's market and into something that required a more honest name. I told my friend Devin about it in December over beers at a bar near my apartment. Devin had known me since college and had the particular gift of listening to a full story before saying anything. I told him everything from the farmer's market to the margin notes in the book. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you followed her into a professional relationship?" I said I prefer to say I pursued a legitimate business opportunity. He said, "And now you work together, and you're very carefully pretending that the rest of it is not a thing." I said I am handling it professionally. He said, "Cole." I said, "Devin." He said, "At what point does handling it professionally become the same as just not doing anything?" I said, "When it stops being the right call." He said, "And when is that?" I said, "I do not know yet." He nodded and drank his beer and said, "Let me know how it goes." I said, "I will." He said, "I already know how it goes." I said, "Nobody asked you." He was right, and I knew it, and I drove home that night thinking about a house in Laurelhurst that was supposed to feel like it had always been this way, and about a woman who left margin notes in books she gave to people without telling them they were there. January arrived with the kind of Portland rain that is not dramatic, just persistent. One Tuesday morning, I came into the studio earlier than expected to drop off a hard drive and found Ren alone at her drafting table at 7:15 with 2 empty coffee cups beside her and a set of drawings she had clearly been working on through the night. She looked up when the door opened, and for just a second before she composed herself, she looked like a person at the end of something rather than the beginning of a day. I set the hard drive down. I did not ask if she was okay, because she would have said yes, and we both would have known it was not the full answer. I went to the small kitchen, washed out the coffee pot, made a full, fresh one, and brought her a cup and set it down without saying anything. She looked at the cup, then at me. Then she said, "The Ashford Project is fighting me." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The East Corridor. I have designed it 4 times, and it is technically right every time, and it does not feel like anything." I sat down across from her and said, "Show me." She looked at me for a moment and then turned the drawings around, and I looked at them for a long time, and then I said, "What is the corridor supposed to feel like?" She said, "Transition, like leaving one thing and arriving at another." I said, "It is not doing that yet, because both ends are equally weighted." She was quiet. I said, "You enter it, and the end looks exactly like the beginning. There is nowhere to go." She looked at the drawings. She picked up a pencil. She made 4 marks on the paper. She sat back and looked at it and said, "That is it." She said it quietly, like something clicking into place. I said, "You would have gotten there." She said, "I had been at it for 11 hours. I said, "Sometimes it takes 11 hours in someone else's eyes." She looked at me across the drafting table with an expression that was not the professional assessing look and not the polite thank you look. Something more open than either. Something she let sit there for a moment before she picked up the pencil again and started working. I left the studio an hour later and walked home in the January rain with my camera bag over my shoulder and thought that I was going to have to say something at some point. Not because I could not keep doing this, but because not saying it was starting to feel like a lie. I was living in a person's presence, and she deserved better than that. I just needed to find the right time. The right time found me before I found it. It was the last Friday in January, and it was raining the way Portland rains in January, which is to say without apology. I had been at the Laurelhurst house all morning shooting the kitchen renovation progress, and I had driven back to the studio to upload and found Rin in the main room with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder and the particular expression of someone who had been planning to leave and had then encountered a complication. The complication was that Gus had taken the studio's van to a site meeting across town, and the streetcar running past the studio was suspended due to a downed wire 3 blocks north, and it was raining sideways, and Ren's car was at the mechanic, and she had a meeting at a client's office in the Nob Hill neighborhood in 40 minutes. She was looking at her phone with the expression of someone running through options and finding them unsatisfying. I said, "I can drive you." She looked up. I said, "My truck is 2 blocks over. It takes 10 minutes to Nob Hill. You will make the meeting." She looked at me for a moment with a weighing expression, and then she said, "Okay, thank you." We ran 2 blocks to my truck in the rain, and she was completely undisguised about running. No graceful pretense, just moving fast because the situation required it, which I found charming in a way I kept to myself. I got the truck unlocked, and we got in, and she shook water off her sleeve and looked out the windshield at the rain and said, "I owe you." I said, "It is 10 minutes in a truck." She said, "I know." I'm still noting it. I pulled out into the traffic, and the rain hit the windshield, and the radio was on low, playing something I had forgotten to change from the night before, which was an embarrassingly earnest acoustic station I listened to when I was editing late. She did not comment on the music. She looked out the window at the wet city going past, and I drove, and the silence was the kind that had settled into its own comfortable weight. At a red light on Burnside, she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." She said, "How did you know about Linden Studio?" I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "Your firm has a good reputation in the architecture photography space." I had been meaning to reach out for a while. She said, I said, "Is that the right answer?" She said, "I am trying to decide." I said, "What are the options?" She said, "Either you're very good at making professional decisions look like coincidences." She paused. "Or you're very bad at pretending they are not." I said, "Which do you think?" She looked at me. I said, "Do not answer that at a red light." She looked back out the window. She said, "I will save it." The light turned green. I drove. We did not talk for the next 4 minutes, but the silence had changed texture. It was a silence that was thinking. I pulled up in front of the client building, and she unbuckled and grabbed her bag and then stopped with her hand on the door and said, "Cole." I said, "Yeah." She turned to look at me properly. She said, "I have been trying to put you in a professional category for 4 months, and you keep not staying there." I said, "I know." She said, "I do not know what to do with that." I said, "I do not need you to do anything with it right now." She said, "But you know that I know." I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." She got out into the rain. Then she looked back in through the door and said, "I will call you when the meeting is done." I said, "I will be around." She closed the door. I watched her walk into the building. Then I pulled back out into the Portland rain and drove, without any specific destination, for about 6 blocks before I realized I was just driving, and pulled over and sat with the engine running and the rain on the roof and the earnest acoustic station still playing, and thought about a woman who had just told me she could not put me in a professional category and had not seemed entirely unhappy about it. She called at 4:15. She said the meeting was good. I said good. She said she was taking the streetcar back. It was running again. I said okay. Then she said, "There's a place on Overton I have been meaning to try for 2 months, and I keep not going because I do not particularly like eating alone." I said, "What kind of food?" She said, "Good food." I said, "When?" She said, "Tonight, if you're not busy." I said, "I'm not busy." We met at 6:30. The place on Overton was a small restaurant with 10 tables and a menu that changed weekly, and a level of intentionality in every dish that reminded me of the way Wren approached a building. Nothing on the plate that was not doing something. We had wine and talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say and without once talking about work. She told me she had grown up in Portland, which surprised me because she had the quality of someone who had chosen the city rather than inherited it. She said she had chosen it. She said growing up somewhere and choosing it as an adult were different things, and she had made the choice consciously at 28 when she could have gone to a bigger market and decided that what she wanted to build belonged here. I told her about growing up in Boise and coming to Portland for a photography program at 22 and staying because the light was different here than anywhere else I had tried to shoot in. She said, "How is it different?" I said, "Flatter, more diffuse. It makes surfaces look honest." She said that is either a very good reason to stay somewhere or a very convenient story. I said it is both. She told me about starting Linden Studio with Gus 9 years ago, when they were both too young to fully understand what they were taking on and how that had turned out to be an advantage, because understanding it fully would have been paralyzing. She told me that architecture had been the only thing she had ever been certain of, and that the certainty had been both the best and most complicated feature of her life. I asked what she meant. She picked up her wine glass and thought about it for a moment. She said, "When you are completely certain about your work, it is very easy to let the work be everything." I said, "Did you let it be everything?" She said, "For a while." She looked at the table, then back at me. She said, "I am working on having it be something important in a life that also has other things in it." I said, "How is that going?" She said, "Ask me in a few months." I held her gaze. She held mine. Outside, the rain had stopped, and through the restaurant window, Portland was doing what Portland does after rain, going glossy and lit and quietly beautiful. I thought about a burnt orange coat at a farmer's market and a woman looking at ceramic mugs with the kind of attention that meant she understood what things were worth. I thought about 4 months of professional proximity and margin notes and a drafting table at 7:15 in the morning and a corridor that was not doing what it was supposed to do yet. I said, Ren. She said, I know. I said, I have been trying to find the right time to say something since approximately October. She said, I know that too. I said, I would like to say it now, if that is okay. She said, go ahead. I said, I am interested in you. Not as a professional contact. Not as a project. As a person. As someone I want to spend time with outside of buildings under construction. As someone whose margin notes in a book of essays are better than the essays and who I would like to have this exact kind of dinner with on a regular basis, if you're open to that. She was quiet for a long enough moment that I had time to sit with it. Then she said, I left those margin notes in the book specifically because I thought you'd read them. I said, I know. She said, and you're only bringing them up now. I said I was waiting until I had something worth saying in return. She looked at me with something that had been carefully contained for 4 months and was now just present on her face in a warm and specific way. She said, okay, Cole. I said, okay. She said, let us do this right. I said, that is the only way I know how to do anything. We left the restaurant at 10 and walked for a while because neither of us was ready to stop. The night air was cold and wet, and Portland was quiet in the way it gets late on winter Fridays when the rain has cleared and the streets have that clean, empty quality that I have photographed 100 times and never once captured the way it actually felt to stand in it. She stopped at the corner of Everett and turned to look at me and said, I need to tell you something. I stopped. She said, I do not move fast. I said, I do not need you to. She said, and I am not easy. I said, I have not found you easy for 4 months, and I have not once thought about going somewhere else. She looked at me for a moment in the winter light. Then she said, good night, Cole. I said, good night, Ren. She walked to her car, and I stood on the corner and watched her go. I walked home in the cold, clear night, thinking that I had waited 4 months to say a true thing, and the true thing had landed, and that felt exactly like what I had hoped it would feel like, and also not at all like what I expected, which was probably the most honest outcome I could have asked for. February in Portland is either the cruelest month or the most honest one, depending on how you feel about extended periods of gray. I was in a phase of finding it honest. I was finding most things honest in February. It had that effect on me. Ren, and I did not rush. We had both spent enough time around things built to last to understand that the foundation mattered more than the pace. We had dinner twice a week and walked on weekends when the weather allowed and talked on the phone on the nights. We did not see each other in the easy way that happens when you have already spent 4 months in honest proximity and the filters are down. She was exactly herself, and I was exactly myself, and the overlap was large enough and the differences were interesting enough that every conversation had somewhere to go. She told me things in February that she had kept in the professional layer in the months before. She told me that her last relationship had ended 3 years ago and that it had ended because she had been so locked into the work that the other person had eventually stopped feeling like they were in a relationship and started feeling like a support structure for one. She said she was not proud of that, but she was honest about it. She said she had spent the years since making sure the work did not take up all the available space. I said, is it working? She said some days better than others. I said, I do not need all the space. She said, I know. She said that is part of what makes this feel different. Gus found out about us by the 3rd week of February in the way people who pay attention find out things, not by being told, but by noticing. He stopped by my work table at the studio one morning while I was editing site photos and looked at the screen for a moment and then said, you look different than you did in November. I said, different how? He said, lighter, he said, like something that was taking up processing power got resolved. I said, that is a very architectural way to describe a person. He said, I spent a lot of time thinking about how things are using their available capacity. He looked at the screen again. She looks different too, he said. I said, I'm glad to hear it. He nodded once. Then he said she has been my partner for 9 years, and she is the best person I know, and she is not someone who needs protecting because she can handle herself. But if that ever stopped being true, I would have something to say about it. I said, I understand completely. He said, good. He went back to his desk. I looked at my screen for a moment, and felt the particular quality of having been assessed and found acceptable by someone whose assessment mattered. The project that third month was the one I had been most looking forward to. A public library branch in the St. John's neighborhood. New construction on a site that had been vacant for 11 years, designed to anchor the corner and invite the neighborhood in rather than simply provide a building. Ren had been working on this project for 2 years before I came on, and she talked about it the way I talked about the best photographs I had ever taken. Like it had been trying to exist for a long time, and the job was to help it arrive. We shot the foundation phase together one morning in late February, which meant we were both on site at 6 in the morning in hard hats and boots in the cold gray Portland light. And I was doing my job, and she was doing hers, and we were in the same place, and it felt exactly right. I got a shot of her standing at the edge of the foundation, looking at the drawings in her hand with the early light coming in from the east and the construction behind her, and her breath visible in the cold air, and it was one of the best photographs I had taken in 3 years. I did not tell her that day. I printed it and framed it and gave it to her 6 weeks later, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then she set it on the windowsill of her office where the north light hit it, and said it makes me look like I know what I'm doing. I said, that is because you do. She said, Cole. I said, yeah. She said, thank you. I said, you're welcome. March arrived, and the days got longer in that specific Portland way, where the light comes back slowly and the city responds to it with something close to relief. The Laurelhurst house finished its renovation phase, and the client held a small gathering to celebrate before they moved in, and Ren and I went together. Not as colleagues, as ourselves. It was the first time we were in a social situation as two people rather than two professionals, and it was, to be honest, completely easy. We talked to the clients and their friends and stood next to each other with the comfortable ease of people who already knew how to exist in the same room. At one point, I handed her a glass of wine without her asking, and she took it without looking, and her hand closed over my fingers for a moment before she took the glass, and neither of us made a thing of it. But I was aware of it for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, she said that felt natural. I said it did. She said, I've been thinking about that, about how something can feel like it already fits before you have had time to break it in. I said, is that a good thing or a suspicious thing? She said, I used to think those were the same category. I said, and now? She said, now, I think some things fit because you put in the time to shape them right, and you do not always notice you are doing it while it's happening. I thought about 4 months of mornings in a studio and site walks and margin notes and books in a corridor that was not working until someone sat down and looked at it for an hour at 7:15 in the morning. I said, I think you're right about that. She looked out the window at the lit streets. Then she said, I am usually right. I said, I know. She said, you're not even going to argue that. I said, you're wrong about one thing. She said, what? I said, the pizza place on Overton. She said, what is wrong with it? I said, I think the place on Mississippi is better. She said, that is an objectively incorrect position. I said, let us go test it. She said, fine. I said, Saturday. She said, Saturday. We went Saturday. She was right about the pizza, and she was gracious about it. And I let her be gracious because she deserved that. Afterward, we walked along the river, and the March air was cold, but the kind of cold that felt like a beginning rather than a continuation of winter. She was quiet in the comfortable way. She was quiet when she was thinking something through, and I walked beside her and gave the thought room and waited. She stopped near the Hawthorne Bridge and looked up at it and said, you shot this in the spring. I said, yes. She said, the photograph implies a relationship between the structure and the water below. I said, I remember. She said, I looked at that photograph before you came in for the portfolio meeting. I said, you did not mention that. She said, I was going to see if you would bring it up. I said, I did not bring it up because I did not know you were looking at it before the meeting. She turned to look at me. She said, I had your whole portfolio pulled up for an hour. I said, why? She said, I kept going back to the bridge photograph, and I was trying to understand what I was responding to in it. I said, did you figure it out? She said, eventually. I said, what was it? She looked at the bridge and then at me. She said, the photographer is present in it without being visible. You can feel that someone was paying careful attention without seeing the person paying it. She said, most people do not know how to do that. Be present without taking up the frame. I looked at her in the river light. I thought about farmers markets and Powell's books and a woman who looked at ceramic mugs like they were worth understanding. I said, Ren. She said, yeah. I said I've been paying careful attention to you since September, and I would like to keep doing that for a significant amount of time. She held my gaze for a moment with those eyes that missed nothing. Then she closed the distance between us and kissed me, straightforward and unhurried, the way she did everything when she had made a decision and was committed to it. My hand found the side of her face, and I held on, and the river moved below the bridge, and the city lit up around us, and neither of us was in any particular hurry. When she pulled back, she stayed close and looked at me and said I should tell you something. I said, go ahead. She said, the day I found you standing outside the studio. I said, yeah. She said, I had seen you before. I said, where? She said, a farmer's market. September. She paused. I was looking at some mugs, and when I looked up, you were looking at me, and you looked away first. I said, that was me. She said, I know. I said, you recognized me. She said, eventually. She said, I put it together around the third week of November and did not say anything because I was watching how you would handle it and whether you would bring it up. I said I was going to tell you. She said, I know. She said, I also know that you emailed the studio and that the email was professional and that you have behaved properly every single day since October. I said, I tried. She said, I noticed. She said, that was also when I knew. I said, knew what? She said that I was going to have a problem keeping you in a professional category. I laughed. She smiled. The real kind, the one that happened before she could decide if it was appropriate, quick and genuine and a little surprised at itself. The exact same laugh I had heard 3 rows ahead of me at Powell's Books in October and had not forgotten. We walked back along the river for a while after that, and I had my arm around her, and she was leaning into my side, and Portland was doing what Portland does in March when the light comes back and the city remembers what it is capable of. At some point, she said, so you followed me into a career-defining professional collaboration and then fell for me along the way. I said I prefer to say I pursued a legitimate business opportunity. She said that is a very convenient story. I said it is also true. She said both can be true. I said that is very architecturally generous of you. She said I'm a generous architect. I said you are. She said, Cole. I said yeah. She said I am glad your curiosity got the better of you. I said so am I. I said for the record, I would do it again. She looked up at me. I said follow you. She held my gaze for a moment in the river light. Then she turned back to the path ahead and tucked herself closer to my side. She said, let us keep walking. We walked. The Hawthorne Bridge held its shape above the water behind us. The relationship between the structure and the river exactly what it had always been. Present and purposeful and not going anywhere. Some things are built to last. Some things you recognize the moment you are patient enough to actually look at them. I had spent 4 months learning the difference.